Hi, coaches. I am Mike Kuchar, senior researcher and co-founder of X&O Labs.com. It is an honor to speak at the Hudl 2021 Blitz Summit. And it's an honor to represent X&O Labs. I'm going to be talking about something today that X&O Labs traditionally does not talk about, which is culture. This has been a different project for us. We spent the entire year researching how 40 programs from at the FBS to FCS to Division II, Division III, and high school level is establishing what we found to be the healthiest form of culture, which is one that is player-driven. So let's dive right in to the presentation. Okay, coaches, I call this presentation Distinctions and Pathways. Again, I'm going to give you the abbreviated version of what we spent a year putting together in study format on how various coaches are developing player-driven culture in their programs. My information is there, my email is there. If there's any questions that anybody has, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to talk about this. I'm excited about this project. We're usually talking about scheme and concepts and things like this, but this is something out of the box for us. So we're very proud of the results of it. So we're more than happy to answer any questions if you have any after the presentation. What is a player-driven culture? This is something that we spend time researching, something that we spent time developing, something that we spent time analyzing. A player-driven culture is one that empowers players with ownership to create and defend a program's core values. I think we're all searching for those things. We're all searching for ownership within our program, and we all want players to take ownership of our culture. We found that it starts by teaching a series of behaviors. Behaviors create habits, habits drive culture. As coaches, and I'm a high school coach myself in New Jersey, it is our job to teach players behaviors that eventually transform them into better people. And we just simply use football as the conduit for doing that. Now, what's most important during the course of this research that we found is that whatever behaviors you're going to teach, and we found the 6 that are most influential in creating player-driven culture. But whatever behaviors you're going to teach and whatever culture you're going to establish, it's important that you develop a system. And we learned that by talking to David Shaw, the head coach at Stanford University, who talked about regardless of what you're doing, whether you're installing offense, defense, or special teams, you have to install your culture. Okay, so we are going to talk through the operational methods. It's a 365-day-a-year, 12-month-a-year job on how you are delivering, designing, and protecting the culture of your program. And that system begins with the what, which is the core value process, which we're going to talk about, transitions into the why, which are the actions that define those values, and culminates with the how, which are the methods used to teach and protect those values. What is the end goal? What is the end game of developing a player-driven culture? Well, what I found is that it's ultimately developing a self-sufficient ball player. Now, that's very important in this day and age. You know, we always talk about the why generation. Okay, players need to know why they are doing what they're doing. Our role as coaches has changed. We are no longer the totalitarian dictator type role. We're going to tell kids what to do and we're going to expect them to do it. Okay, you have to tell them why they are doing what they're doing, or else they will never understand the purpose of doing it. So what I found when I was doing my research in what makes up a player-driven culture, I found that it's a tactical standpoint and a behavioral standpoint. All right, when you think about the game of football, as opposed to other sports like rugby, like soccer, like basketball, where coaches could dictate instruction as the play is going on. Football is different. Once the ball is snapped, from the snap to the echo of the whistle, you don't have much control over players' decision-making process. So it is our job to train them to make the right decisions in critical moments of the game. All right, and that comes with what I refer to and what Coach Brown refers to at West Virginia University as whole person development. Okay, are we developing players in 5 domains? Mental, physical, behavioral, tactical, and technical. Okay, many coaches that we talked to in doing this study felt like they are not doing their jobs unless they are developing players in those 5 domains. They are the ones that are making those corrections on the field and have to make the right adjustments. So that's why it's important that we teach them how to do so. So how do we get there? You know, this is something that I wanted to research. We always hear about culture. You know, it's always when things go right, we hang our hat on it. When things go wrong, we blame it. Okay, but what is it? What is culture in terms of a player-driven culture? And more importantly, how do we get there as coaches? I will tell you, it's a continual effort. It's a continual pursuit, and it is it's a progress-driven pursuit and not a results-driven pursuit, which we're going to talk about. I wanted to identify 6 distinctions between a coach-driven and a player-driven culture. This is what I found to be the 6 main distinctions when I was looking at over 40 programs and how they develop their culture. And this is what I found. Number 1, standards replace rules. And I'll go over each of these a little more in depth. Messaging replaces signage. Number 3, progress goals replace performance goals. Number 4, connectivity replaces inclusivity. Number 5, failing replaces failure. And number 6, ownership replaces alignment. So if I look at this and just to give you an outline of what the player-driven culture system is, I found these main distinctions. Okay, when we talk about the difference between a coach-led culture and a player-driven culture. And one important distinction to make here, coaches, is that the coach is still in control of his culture. Okay? You establish it as a coach, you bestow it upon your players, players take ownership of your core values, and their role becomes to protect and defend those core values, where our role becomes to advocate. All right, so we could spend more time doing things we need to do, like skiing, game planning, okay, well, we don't even have to worry about the culture. And I think there have been situations in our lives where we've had players, individual players, take control of the culture. Well, the goal is to have the majority of players take control of the culture in the player-driven program. First thing, standards replace rules. I don't know if we are coaches that come up with 10 or 15 or more rules than that. Be on time. Do not engage in any alcoholic activity. Show up to class. You know, we've been around a lot of coaches that have a listicle of rules that they must follow. In the player-driven culture, the standards replace the rules. Well, what are the standards? Once you develop your core values as a program, it becomes the player's responsibility to develop the standards that follow or that define those core values. All right. Now, Coach Herm Edwards at Arizona State, we interviewed him regarding the study. He told us that players are willing to accept standards because the word standards usually indicates something that they need to live up to. Rules indicate that you as a coach are denying them something. So when we think about that, the standards replace the rules in the player-driven culture. Okay. And we all heard Coach McVay at the Los Angeles Rams talk about the standard is the standard. Well, what are those standards and how are you defining those standards for your players? We're going to take a look at that next. So this is an example of the standards that define the core values of your program. This is Tri-Valley High School out in Ohio. Coach Burke is the head coach out that way, and he was part of this study, and he was gracious enough to talk about how he develops those standards in his programs. And what I found interesting about this, and what I really like about this, is that coach defines those standards in 4 facets of players' environment. He defines them on field, he defines them in the classroom, he defines them in the weight room, and he defines them in the community. So if we're not doing that as coaches, I don't think we are doing a good enough job in setting our expectations or setting the standards. So if you could see here, Coach Burke has 3 core values: relentless effort, elite competitors, and brotherhood. Within those core values, he defines what those standards are. And he elicits help from his leadership council or a few of the seniors or juniors or, you know, some of the coaching staff in doing so. So just to give you an example here, what relentless effort means on the field. It means all gas, no brakes, 100 miles per hour. Okay, I think coaches, we all want that, right? We all expect that from our players. Then you take a look at off the field. What's relentless effort mean off the field? It means making mature decisions and purposeful actions. All right. So, you're not writing a list of things. Don't engage in, don't be involved in drugs, or, don't engage in alcoholic activity. Whatever your standards are, your rules as a program, it doesn't have to be written out. It's part of the standards. And then when you see what it looks like in the weight room, what's relentless effort look like in the weight room? No waste of time. So if you have a kid in there doing a bench press or doing squatting, okay, then they're sitting there talking to their buddy for 3 minutes without going on to the next lift, they are not exhibiting the standards of Tri-Valley High School. Okay. So what I like about this is that everything is defined. And then you see in the classroom, what's relentless effort sitting in the front of the class. So if Coach Burke walks past a chemistry class and one of his star linebackers is not sitting in the front of the class, well, they are not exhibiting the standards of the program. So I think it's important in a player-driven culture, once you develop whatever core values you have, and we talk about in the study having a rule of 3, that seems to be the common way of doing things. You see an example here, they have 3 core values. Whatever core values you have, it's important to define what those core values are for your players. So there's no gray area. It's all black and white. The standard is the standard. Here's what it looks like in these 4 domains of your life. Next, messaging replaces signage. We were lucky enough to interview Tim Kite for this study. Now, Tim Kite was basically the culture advocate and the culture builder that Coach Urban Meyer brought in 2012 when he first took over at Ohio State University. And one of the stories that Tim Kite told us when we were doing our research, that he told us that when he was observing how Coach Meyer was teaching culture, and we all know what a great culture communicator Coach Meyer is, he noticed that Coach Meyer and his strength coach, Mickey Mariotti, were the only coaches that were preaching that culture, whereas other assistant coaches were not really conveying that message. And what he told us is that basically culture is communicated daily. All right. Documents don't grow culture. Posters don't build culture. Conversations build culture. All right. And he talked about, for us, building culture is something that has to happen daily through messaging. Now, I'm going to give you some examples of some of that messaging that coaches use to convey their culture. But I think it's important that we realize that this is not culture. I think we've been in plenty of weight rooms where we see this signage up there. This was Coach Rickards at Kearns High School in Utah contributed this to our study. And he basically just talked about, this is not culture. You see the slogans on there. You see the slogans on the back of students' T-shirts. That doesn't mean what culture is. We see a lot of pride on the back of T-shirts. Well, can that player define what pride is or how pride relates to that program? That's a different story. Otherwise, the words are shallow, they're empty, they don't mean anything. Okay, that's not what culture is. So how do coaches continually message the culture? That was something that we studied. And we found that it's all about messaging the core values. Coach Ed Odrone at LSU was a contributor to this study. And he told me that his biggest regret when he first got the head coaching job in Mississippi was that every time he got in front of the group, he didn't realize how important that role was. Okay. And he wasn't laser focused on continually preaching the why. Okay. We talked about that earlier, why the culture is important, why the standards are important. It's important that coaches are deliberate and illustrative. Dabo Sweeney, who was also Coach Dabo Sweeney, also a contributor to this study. He talked about being continual and intentional. And this is something that this does not get lost on him. We all know Coach Sweeney, the great speaker that he is. He always communicates the culture to his players in a way where it's relative every day. At Southern Methodist University, Coach Sonny Dykes talks about 4 things that he's going to do every time he tells the players to do something. He's going to tell them why they're doing it. He's going to tell them how it's going to take care of them. He's going to tell them how it's going to make them a better player. And he's going to tell them how that's going to make them a better team. So I think it's important that us as coaches continually message these core values. How do we do it? Several ways. Number 1, text messaging. We all have our players' texts on their cell phones. I don't know what your district is in terms of policies and communicating with players, but it's not just about, texting them to see how they're doing. I know several coaches that will text some type of influential message or some motivational message every day at 6:30 a.m. Okay, Coach O'Neill at Manhattan High School in Kansas, the defensive coordinator there, does this with his defensive players. Google resources, where I'm sure we all have Google Classroom. We all have Google Drive. We could share information back and forth to one another. Okay, continually preaching that message. Social media, Twitter, Instagram. Are you connecting with your players to talk about what's important in terms of culture? All right, are they following you so you could give that message? You know, a lot of coaches that we talk to, they believe in the messaging of Twitter. Some did not, but many did. In fact, Coach Shaw at Stanford told us that there's no restrictions. Coach Brown of West Virginia, no restrictions in terms of tweeting things out, as long as players are responsible and research their points before putting it out there on social media, okay, to understand the other side of things, which is an educational process within itself. Book studies. I don't know how many of us actually organize book studies in our programs. Instead of just giving a book and telling players to read it, does your book represent the core values of your program? For us, we read Chop Wood, Carry Water, because we have a younger group this year and we have to teach the element of perseverance and persistence. Well, it's important to find a book to convey that messaging. It's something that we don't have to do. It's conveyed through literature. Core value cut-ups. How many of us actually spend time on Hudl making 10 to 12 playlists on not scheme, but a culture cut-up? For me as an offensive line coach, run game coordinator, every time an offensive lineman, we got a double team, we got vertical movement, we got a finish on the whistle, I am putting a core value cut-up so players could see that that's the culture that's expected at Rahway High School. And finally, historical context. Coach Sweeney will show his players clips of CJ Spiller, okay, and things that he has done in the program. I know the staff at Iowa, who's also contributed to the study, talk about their great tight ends and some of their tight ends and what they did. They show clips of some of the things that they did, and they tell the story of these players, okay, and give players that are in the program now some background on how those former players carried the culture and the core values of the program. I call that historical cut-ups, and it's something that we could all do. These are all examples that you could do in your program right now to message the core values of your culture. This is one example of messaging. This was submitted by the staff at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. I said that right. Head coach Ralph Isernia is over there, a very reputable Division III program. And what they do every year is that they come up with an illustration. And on that illustration, they call it one word. So each player on the roster writes or illustrates one word that represents that culture. And I'm not going to read this to you. You can see all these examples here. Why is that important? It's messaging. Okay. When players come into the locker room, that's the first thing that they see. It's continual and deliberate messaging. All right. And it's there in their face every day. And more importantly, players created it. They took ownership of the culture by devising the word that they think best fits their culture and best fits their program. So that's one example of continual messaging that is contributed by the players. This is another example of deliberate and intentional messaging. This was submitted by Eastern Michigan University. Head coach Chris Creighton was a contributor to this study. And he talked about each position group coming up with their one-word example. All right, what defines them? What is going to be their identity? And you can see here grit, which is something we're going to talk about, dominate, relationship, solid. So this hangs in the wide receiver meeting room at Eastern Michigan, where players come in and they see that, okay? It's right in front of their face. It's illustrative. They design it. Pretty good artwork, I must say. I could not do that. But they design it, they illustrate it, and now it's intentional. When they come into the meeting room, it's there for them, and that's what's in front of them. Next, progress goals replace performance goals. When doing this study, I found 75% of coaches have some type of goal-setting model for their players, which is great. I'm surprised that 25% did not. However, of that 75%, only 29% of them had action plans. Okay, if you are establishing goals for your players, that's terrific. The difference is in the player-driven program, goals are more progress-driven, not results-driven. Why? Because progress influences behaviors. Okay, now I'm not saying that performance goals are off the table. You don't want to be 1,000-yard rusher, want to have 100 catches, that's fine. All right, but it's important in the player-driven culture that these goals are delivered collaboratively from position coach to head coach to player. And then whatever goal that is, and coaches were not, they told me they were not inhibited by their goals. Okay. If a player that was a sophomore that got no varsity experience wanted to be first team All-State, they did not hinder that goal for that player. What they did is they developed an action plan as specific as possible in how to get to that goal. Okay. And these action plans should include challenges. They're devised collaboratively by player and coach. If you don't do this, it could seriously impede a player's progress. Okay. We're going to show you a couple examples here in a second of these action plans. So this is a progress-based goal structure that I found in conducting a study. We have our performance-based goal, right? Players want performance-based results. They want to be 1,000-yard rushers. You see in the example here. All right, that's fine. Well, what's the developmental-based goal? I think that's important that we help them establish that. It's eliminating mental errors, okay? That's something, and you know your players. That's part of the thing as coaches. We have to understand what our players' limitations are as well. So in this particular example, eliminating those mental errors could help this player get to a 1,000-yard rushing season. What's the action plan? Well, devote more time studying to the core fundamentals of the position. So players get this information and they continually meet with their coaches in order to make sure they are on track. I will tell you that Neil Brown, the head coach at West Virginia, meets with his players 4 times a year. He meets with them in the summer before camp. He meets with them after the season. He meets with them during winter conditioning, and then at the end of spring ball. So, it's continual evaluation process. It's continual assessment, but this will give you a good idea of what a progress-based goal structure looks like, all right, with an action plan. I'm going to dig a little deeper here now and show you one a little more specific. Okay, this is from University School in Ohio. Coach Ben Malbasa is the head coach over there. I really like this goal progression, okay, for several reasons. First thing, if you see over here, he starts with asking players what their 3 goals are. All right, he gives examples: no miss assignments, average 6 yards per carry. You see how specific it is. It's not just about being all conference, okay? Specific goals. We all seen the SMART goal initiative, okay, years ago that helped people put together their goals in their lives. Now, after they list their goals, he asks them to list their strategies. Well, this is the action plan, okay? It should be specific and it should be measurable. I think that's important that we understand that. What does it take to accomplish your ultimate goal? Now, Coach Malbasa takes it one step further. This was one of the more extensive goal progressions that I've read from a high school level when doing my study, because he gets into the mental toughness training, and you could take a look at that for yourself in terms of performance. He talks about a highlight reel, okay, which is mental toughness again. But here's the personal statement. This is what's also important in terms of the goal. So coach and his staff will have each player devise a personal statement, okay, which is basically affirmation on what they can do or what they choose to do. And you could see some of the examples here. So players are entrusted with putting that affirmation down, putting it out there. We know how important it is for goals to be out in front of your face. I know some players put it in their lockers or their refrigerators so they could see it every day. That gives you an idea of making sure that you see that goal each and every day. Then he takes it one step further by including the entire unit. Now, how many of us do this? This was something to me that I've never done, but I'm going to do next off season or when we play next year, where it's a weekly performance log. So now he asks those players within their unit, offensive line, receivers, whatever it may be, to evaluate what they did well during the course of the game that week. 3 things they did well. What do they need to improve on? How could they help make this improvement? That's the action plan, right? Because we found that when we did our research, goals are established in 4 ways. You have lifelong goals. You have seasonal goals, which is an example here. You have weekly goals, which is here for each week during the season. And then you have daily goals. There were some coaches that contributed to the study, Florida State University and Coach Mike Norvell. Some of his defensive staff will actually write a goal on the practice plan for each individual player. So a safety, maybe come in with better pad level on tackles or get better eyes on a quarterback, play post safety defense. Whatever that goal is, that's written on the practice plan. Okay, and that's evaluated every day. So you could go as far as to have daily goals for your players. during practice. So I think that's a really good idea. But you can see here, it develops ownership of this goal. It develops, players are allowed to assess themselves. We talk about the self-sufficient or the self-corrective football player. It could be done right here. And more importantly, it takes autonomy on what these players can do to help their unit during the course of the week. And those action plans become the impetus of what they are working on that next week. Coach told me that one of the receivers group talked about not getting off the ball when they were run blocking, okay, during one particular week. So that was the goal that following week. The entire unit group for receivers just worked continuously, feverishly on getting off the ball on stalk blocks and looking to, through, and beyond the defensive back to sell the run game. So I thought that was a great point in terms of a weekly goal plan, not just individually, but unit-based. Next, connectivity replaces inclusivity. I'm going to get a little philosophical on you now. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. When I was doing this, I remember going back to there. I'm an English teacher by trade, and I remember Maslow talked about belonging and self-actualization being more desired than any possessions as individuals. You know, we want recognition. We are human beings. Well, how do we get recognition? How do we get our players recognition? All right, we connect them. Now, connectivity is different than inclusivity. That's something that I really developed during my research for this project. I think we all have paintball outings or bowling nights well, during COVID, we couldn't do any of those things, but virtual movie nights, I don't know, with our players. Maybe we have these t-shirts that we give the janitorial staff, all right, around our building, or we give the teachers, you know, some type of t-shirt or whatever it may be. But there is a difference in terms of connectivity. How many of us are actually bringing those teachers in to our program? How many of us are bringing them in where they actually address the team before practice or before games? Or we sit with them during lunch, or we allow them to be on the field during a game as, you know, honorary coaches. There is a difference between connectivity and inclusivity. PJ Fleck, the head coach of Minnesota, we all know what type of culture builder he is. He talked about culture by definition is connecting people. Bronco Mendenhall, University of Virginia, talked about the only way to produce growth is by honest and brutal feedback. So connectivity is bringing people in and connecting them to your program. How are you connecting people to your program? I call this the how. I got it from Coach Fleck. He really gets into it. He calls it the how meter. And that's in the study as well in terms of different facets of the program, academics, socioeconomics, fundraising, how he's connecting all of those elements into his program. Well, what I found is that this connectivity is developed in 4 areas. Player-to-player connectivity. How are you connecting your players to each other? This could be something called spontaneous check-ins, which I'm going to show you here in a second. It could be peer mentorships, where you're putting together freshmen and seniors, or you're putting together students by academic major, or by hobby, or by friendship, or by strangers. No one knows each other, whatever it may be. Peer-to-peer instruction. Okay, there's coaches that are part of the study that actually have seniors get on the board and teach younger players the offensive or defensive system. How great is that? You talk about this peer group. What do they learn from? They learn from their peers more than they learn from adults, because they respect their peers sometimes more than they respect adults. All right, so that could be part of that process. Player to coach connectivity. How are you developing or connecting each player to their coach? I know in high school that may be a different story. In college, I know when I played, I didn't even know any of the offensive players or offensive staff. That's done by life story models. Coach Hill over at Weber State, who's a disciple of Urban Meyer, has each coach get up and talk about their story to their players. And each player does the same thing in camp. Book study models, we talked about that. Off-field integration sessions. Coach McElgreen at Central Michigan was a part of this study. He will randomly group players in with a coach and have them go eat breakfast. A coach will be in the weight room just with that group, and then he'll rotate groups just to develop some connectivity from player to coach. Coach to coach connectivity. One of the best ways I found that coaches are connecting each way to the other, besides retreats, are what we called autopsies. Now, Coach Randy Jackson, we all know what type of communicator he is of culture. He's the head coach of North Forney High School, he will have coaches evaluate other positions, okay, or other position coaches. And he will ask them, number one, what did the unit do well? Number two, what does the unit need to fix? And number three, what is the system put in place to fix those issues? So he has the coaches connected to each other. And number four, program to community connectivity. That could be based on the demographics. I know Coach Dowling over in Iowa, he has, Iowa, it's a Catholic school in Iowa. He has several ethnicities within his program. Okay, so he has to make sure in his leadership council, he is diverse. And he actually has a diversity council to talk through some of those social issues. Historical context, where is your program? Is your program tied to something in history? Okay, we had a coach contribute something that they do. They go to there's a house in the Underground Railroad, okay, that they go and they see every summer just to connect themselves with the town. Socioeconomics, community leadership. Coach Justin Fuente at Virginia Tech University will bring in, he calls it Wisdom Wednesdays, where he'll bring in someone from the campus community to address his players. So these are all things that we could do to find a way in the player-driven culture to connect our program to things around it. This is the 2-minute check-in. I love this. This is done at North Dakota State University. Coach Enns, he does this every preseason. Okay, he is going to find a way to break down barriers within his program, especially with incoming freshmen. I think he had 30 this year that he told me that are coming into the program this year, and pairing these incoming freshmen with fifth-year seniors. All right, there is one rule. We have these discussions. The rule is to be vulnerable. So he will pair up these players, and they will ask a total of 4 questions. Number 1, who is your hero? Number 2, what has been your greatest moment or achievement that is non-sports related? Number 3, what has been your biggest moment of adversity or an obstacle in life? And number 4, what is holding you back from your way to the top of the mountain? Are you battling any insecurities? All right. This is a way for players to connect with each other the first time they see each other. Coach Enns told me that there's a lot of times in these meetings, it gets emotional, and players are talking about things that as coaches, we would have no way of knowing unless we ask them. Okay. And that's all about being vulnerable. It's all about allowing them to speak and giving a platform for our players to express themselves. Okay. Something else we're going to get into here in a little bit. Next, failing replaces failure. I think we've all read the Angela Duckworth book on grit, when she talked about studying 2,400 military cadets to find out what separates those that were successful. And she found that grit or perseverance was the main factor. Okay, we probably all read Carol Dweck's book on mindset and how you approach things. Are you coming from a growth mindset where you could learn things from your failures, or are you coming from a fixed mindset? Well, we as football coaches need to continually find ways to get our players to fail. Now, that comes with a couple things which we'll get into here, but I think it's important to make a distinction that failing, which is a verb, is different than failure, which is a noun. Okay? We're either failing is growing. Okay? That's essentially what it comes down to. PJ Fleck told us it's a coach's job to get his players to fail every day. Now, what we found, we wanted to study how coaches are getting their players to fail. Okay? How are they teaching grit? How are they teaching perseverance in their program? I found it could be taught 2 ways. The first way is cognitive response training, which we're going to get into here in a second, where you're getting players to basically be proactive and not reactive in handling any potential adversity or failure. Number 2, recall. Okay? Some coaches will put on a tape from another team that maybe has committed some penalties and that maybe has shown some things during the course of the game that was not advantageous for them. You could learn from those things. Okay? Coach Fuente of Virginia Tech actually puts together a cut-up during Friday night football games or Thursday night ESPN football games to show to his players on Saturday things that they could learn from so it doesn't happen in their game. You could also train it physically. A lot of coaches engage in body language assessments. Florida State University measures body language. They have a 1 to 5 scale. We include that in the study. We break down how they assess it, how they grade it, and how they carry it forward with action plans. Drill work. Are your drills set up so players can fail? If you're doing a reach drill from a defensive end or 5 technique on an offensive tackle, are you starting him from a disadvantageous position? I think you have to, because now you're teaching that it's okay to fight back, and you're teaching perseverance to get back into an optimal position. Game situations. Dave Clausen, the head coach at University of Wake Forest, who contributed to this study. He has a football 101 that he teaches players every possible situation in the game. He talks about it, he goes over each situation, and then they go on the field to reenact it. So if they don't get it right on Thursday or Friday in practice, more specifically Thursday, if they don't get it right, okay, they move on. And then Saturday, it becomes second nature. They become comfortable in these adverse situations. So Tim Kite came up with this E plus R equals O formula. Event plus your response to that event equals the outcome. We all know how important it is to teach response. All right. It's proactive, not reactive teaching. All right. It can be done. So he does this, when he gets hired, he comes in, he actually has players sit down in either a whole group or positional group, and he does some role playing. Well, we'll ask players, what is a social event that you tend to respond to badly? What is an academic event that you tend to respond to badly? What is a football event that you tend to respond to badly? And players address those responses, and then they get in breakout rooms and talk to their position coaches and talk to each other about how they should handle those particular situations. That was the baseline of the E plus R equals O formula. I wanted to dig deeper as a researcher. I wanted to find out how coaches are taking that E plus R equals O and applying it to their specific programs. Here's an example of that. This is Muskego High School in Wisconsin. I believe I'm saying that right. All right, what they do hours before the game, they conduct this response training. And it's a visualization exercise where the staff will come up with 5 to 10 possible adverse situations. And you can see the line of questioning here. Number 1, what if we fumble on the opening offensive series of the game? Number 2, what if we allow a score on the opening defensive series of the game? Number 3, what if a bad call is made? Number 4, what if I jump off sides? They go through the right response for each of those scenarios. So if it happens in a game, the players are prepared and the right response is expected. The standard is expected. I thought this was awesome. I think this is something that we could do as coaches during the course of our game. It's not being negative. A lot of coaches come from a superstitious background, or we don't want to talk about these things before it happens. Well, this is a matter of being prepared, okay, and understanding that players have to respond to these situations in a game. And as coaches, if we're not preparing them or training them, we can't expect them to respond the right way. We have to train the response. So this is a great example of that. Finally, the last distinction, ownership replaces alignment. This, I feel, is the ultimate form of a player-driven culture. When players own it, as Coach Niblett over the powerhouse in Alabama, Hoover High School, talks about, ownership is the most powerful word in team sports. Okay? Now, there is a difference between ownership and alignment. Some of us that coach at the high school level, players are going to come in. They're going to listen to you because it's their job to do so. They're going to be aligned, at least in the beginning. Okay? Because alignment is obtained by title. It's an act of compliance. I'm going to listen to coach because he has the head football coach plaque on his desk. All right, so I'm going to listen to him, whatever it may be. But ownership is different. Ownership is obtained on love and trust, where players own their performance, their action, and in turn their lives. And again, the entire pursuit of this is a progress-driven pursuit, not a results-driven pursuit. Okay, so how do you get ownership? How do you infuse ownership? To me, what I found, it comes with self-advocacy. And self-advocacy is a way where we as coaches are providing a platform for players to communicate their needs. Okay? If we're not doing that as coaches, we are not in a player-driven culture environment. All right? We have to set the dynamic where players are open and honest and transparent to come express their needs to us, with the understanding that we have their best interests at heart. It's about understanding specific needs. It's about knowing what help or support will address those needs. And I found, when doing my research, that this self-advocacy is developed in 4 ways: leadership, nutrition, academics, and time management. Okay, and I'm going to give you a great example here on how we could empower our players to be advocates of what their needs are. This is what I feel to be one of the best submissions that we had during the course of our study. This was contributed by St. Xavier High School in Ohio, Coach Steve Specht, head coach, Coach Coverdale, the offensive coordinator. What they do in their program with the help of their training staff is they allow players every week to complete a wellness survey. And this is something that, if nothing else, I think this is something that we all need to implement in our program immediately, where players are given the freedom and they do this, they put their name to it, but it's something that's done every week where they get to assess their well-being. And it's done on several platforms. You can see over here to the left: fatigue, physical soreness, sleep, academic stress, personal stress, and nutrition. So players rank themselves on a 1 to 5 scale. This is the rubric, okay? We can see what 1 looks like. We can see what 5 looks like. The players rank themselves every week on these. They submit it to the position coach and to the trainer. Coach Speck gets it. He reviews it. And then this serves as the basis for these follow-up discussions, serves as a basis for follow-up action plans. All right, coach talked about 1 week there was 1 week during practice, there was standardized testing going on. It might've been the SAT. And he felt that many of the players were not getting enough rest. Okay, and he said he devised, and a lot of them had undersleep, 1s or 2s, awful or below average. And you can see what below average means. It's all defined here. And he said that week in practice, he cut practice time down because he felt like he needed to accommodate the needs of their players. Well, without something like this, we would not know what our needs of our players are. I think those of us that coach high school, 17, 18-year-old, 16-year-old kids, there's a lot of pride there. Okay, they're going to tell you what you want to hear, not necessarily tell you how they feel. Well, this is a way for them to express their needs digitally, and then you could take that information, filter it, analyze it, quantify it, and then adjust during the course of the practice, during the course of the season, during your season, whatever you may say here. Okay, and this is something that is very influential, that we could get a good feel on each of these categories, what our players are thinking, how they are feeling, and how we can accommodate them moving forward. So there's a great example of self-advocacy that could be done. He does it every week. It can be done once a month, whatever you feel like you need to do as a staff to help gauge the chemistry and the wellness of each individual player in your program. Okay, coaches, I want to thank you for your attention. I mean, it's always difficult in a 45-minute time period to talk about a lot of things that were in this study. It's a 246-page study. All the resources and documentation that you saw me go over is available to that study, which is available on our website here. And we're proud of it. It's something that we've never done before at X&O Labs, but it really became a labor of love for me to talk about how these coaches are developing a player-driven culture system. We had 40 contributing sources. All of them are there at the high school level, FCS and FBS level. But the main point that I want to get across to you is, regardless, culture is selective. Culture is objective, right? I mean, each program has its unique culture. So it doesn't matter what your core values are going to be. It doesn't matter what your standards are going to be. But the purpose and the point is to develop a system to teach players to own those standards. And we found that best comes with teaching these 6 behaviors that we uncover in the study. I want to thank Hudl for putting on this tremendous opportunity for a virtual clinic. I know we can't sit around and drink beers and talk football anymore right now. Okay, so there's a great platform in doing so. I appreciate the organizers for including X&O Labs, and feel free to reach out to me or our team with any questions you have regarding the study. Thank you for logging in, and thank you for listening.